All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this educational session on hard urban boundaries. My name is Stephanie Bush, and I work at the Halton Environmental Network. On behalf of HEN and all of the community partners who helped to spread the word about this event, we thank you for joining us for this presentation and discussion. I'd just like to point out that the groups who offered support in spreading the word about this event include Halton Food, Greening Sacred Spaces, the Oakville Green Conservation Association, Burlington Green, Sustainable Milton, the Halton Climate Collective, the Halton Hills Climate Action Group, Grandmothers Act to Save the Planet, otherwise known as GASP, and the CFUW of Oakville, so the Canadian Federation of University Women's Oakville Chapter. We appreciate your support so much. Your combined efforts really help to reach a much wider audience, and we appreciate that outreach on our behalf. So we will move forward. If I can get the slides to move, there we go. It feels particularly significant given this topic tonight that we acknowledge the land where we call home. So let me begin by saying, as a community, we have the responsibility to honor, care for, and respect all the creation gives to provide us with life. This includes the land, water, air, fire, animals, plants, and our ancestors. The Anishinaabe peoples have utilized this land for millennia, and we would like to acknowledge their direct descendants, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as the rightful caretakers and title holders of this land upon which we live, work, and conduct ourselves. We acknowledge our treaty relationship and responsibilities to both the land and these original peoples. We also recognize that this land is rich in pre-contact history and customs, which include the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, and since European contact has and continues to become home for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And it is in the spirit and intent of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, whereby we will collectively care for and respect the land, water, animals, and each other in the interests of peace and friendship, and for the benefit of not only ourselves, but of our future descendants. So this evening we are running a webinar session. What that means is that all attendees will remain muted and without video option. The chat box is open to make comments about the topic at hand and to let us know if you are having any technical challenges. If that's the case, someone will be reaching out to you as soon as possible to try to help you. I also invite you to use the chat box this evening to let us know where it is that you're joining us from, because that would be great to know where everyone is. We will run a question and answer period at the end of the session, but you're invited to use the Q&A button, which is just at the bottom of your screen when you hover your cursor there, in order to ask questions. So rather than through the chat, please ask your questions through the Q&A. There's also an option to look at those questions and essentially vote for them. So if there's a question you also want asked, you can vote for that. And then I can see at the end when we're moderating those questions, which ones tend to be most popular if we find that we're running out of time a little bit. So as I said, the questions will be done at the end of the session, and please use the Q&A rather than the chat. The chat is open again for comments as we go through the presentation. I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers tonight. We are welcoming three panelists, Kevin EBY, Ann Joyner, and Peter Lambrick. Peter is joining us through phone, so we won't get to see him, but we do have an image so that when you hear his voice, you'll know what he looks like and who's speaking. So to start, Kevin EBY is a professional planner and the former director of community planning for the Regional Municipality of Waterloo, where he supervised the region's growth management strategy. Kevin also participated in the province's Places to Grow growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe from 2004 to 2006. Since 2015, Kevin has been providing consulting services through EBY GMPS. Peter Lambrick, who we have by phone this evening, has been a farmer in Halton Region since the mid-1970s. He has been active in the Halton Agricultural Advisory Committee and more recently has become a member of the Halton Natural Heritage Advisory Committee. Ann Joyner is a professional planner with more than 25 years of experience managing multidisciplinary projects that combine environmental assessment, urban design, planning, and sustainability. Ann has worked on a number of growth management projects throughout the GTA. She is currently a senior advisor for Dillon Consulting and was the planner in residence at the University of Waterloo last year in 2020. I welcome all of you. Very pleased to have your expertise here this evening. I'm going to invite Kevin to start us off, providing us with some understanding and context of hard urban boundaries. Then he will pass the baton to Ann, who will speak with us about what could happen within our developed boundaries that may support a hard urban boundary. Lastly, Ann will pass to Peter so that he can share his perspective from a rural and agricultural lens. The Q&A will be facilitated toward the end of the session. So Kevin, I invite you to share your slides at this time and to begin.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to do a brief overview of our experiences in the region of Waterloo. And although we didn't do a hard urban boundary, fully hard at least, we did something close. But I want to give you some context as well to it. And why will that not go? That's why. I eventually figure it out. This is the urban boundary, I'm sorry, the built-up areas that existed in 1960 in the region of Waterloo. This was before the region became a region, and in fact, you see Hespeler, Galt, and Preston there. And this is how the building occurred over the decades. And you see Cambridge appear, 1990, we come to 2000, and we have a significant amount of development that's occurred within that 30-year period. And just to look back on it, this is 1970. And as we were growing, we recognized that if we just continue on, it just becomes perpetual. We'll move out into all of the areas around. And we, in the early 2000s, we stepped back and took a look at it. And one of the things that we realized is there's two significant reasons for looking at stopping the outward creep of the municipality. First, there's protection of the resources on the outside, but there's also another really important one. I'll just take 2 minutes to explain it. And that is, if you look at the urban areas that existed in 1970, and you look at 2000, you recognize that all of this development is supported by infrastructure that was built between 20 and 50 years ago. Virtually all of it was paid for through lot levies or development charges, and councils of the day really looked upon it as free assessment, and they encouraged it. Like almost everywhere else, we had tight staging policies, but you go out because you need the assessment. And about this time, we began to realize, if you look back at that again at 1970, and you look at 2000 and you think, all of a sudden, we're going to have to, on the taxpayer's dollar, replace all of this infrastructure within the next 10 to 20 years. This is a huge financial liabilities for municipalities. So one of the things we looked at in the region of Waterloo was, if we start to turn the development back into the urban area, in fact, that would allow us to help use some of the development charges that otherwise created new infrastructure and new liability on the outsides. That would help us to replace some of the existing infrastructure while we expanded for the additional development. So all of a sudden, we started talking about this, and it made sense financially from a municipal standpoint to take a look at it. But it also is important to look at the outside and what you're protecting by not going there. And certainly in the region of Waterloo, there's significant prime agricultural areas. We had, at that point, we were just moving ahead with what we called environmentally sensitive landscapes. And if you look at the one in the kind of middle left, this is the Laurel Creek Headwaters ESL. And you can see that, one of the this meets one of our major criteria, was that about 50% of the area is actually high order environmental area. The next big one for us was the Waterloo Moraine, and the black outline is the entirety of the Waterloo Moraine, but in fact, it's a very complex geologic area. And it was formed mainly, there was a number of different ways, but there were two glaciers that came in. One came in from the north and the west, and laid down what's you see there is kind of the white area underneath, and that's all sand and gravel. Several thousand years later, or 100 years later, another one came in from the east, and it was considerably thicker, ground up the material an awful lot more, and laid a clay aquitard on the eastern flank of the Waterloo moraine. So in some areas, we have no natural protection of the aquifer at all. And by somewhat sheer luck, the municipal portions are virtually have clay underneath them. And the outlet from the moraine is the Grand River on the right-hand side. So this is the kind of green is the recharge area. These are the areas without any geologic protection. There's a few of them creep into our existing urban area, which is in white, but generally we've managed to stay out of them. And recognizing this is, again, we're talking about the year 2000. Another key one for us in the region of Waterloo was the cultural heritage aspect of the Mennonite and Amish communities that are located basically in the north and northwest of our community. So as we started looking at what growth was going to look like, at this point, we were only looking at a planning horizon of 2031. It was important to get enough land designated to accommodate urban development within that. And that's where most municipalities end, is right there. But we recognize that you couldn't just plan for 2031 and ignore what was on the outside. There are some parts of our urban area where it made absolutely no sense for future expansions to occur. And so why are we sizing pipes that are aiming out into locations where we don't want development? And so what we did was we went through the process and defined what's really the region of Waterloo Greenbelt to some extent. It's our protected countryside. And it's got our environmentally sensitive landscapes. It's got our key areas of the moraines. And in fact, we put policy in place that says, you can't go there, you can never go there, it's permanently frozen. And we restricted some uses that otherwise would be allowed in the agricultural area, like golf courses and things like that because of some issues. But essentially, we did that. And again, we could have stopped there, but we felt what was really important was it's not just telling you where not to go. We wanted to take a look beyond 2031 and show people where the next growth will occur. And in fact, as we did that, what it did was it opened up the opportunity for us to include these lands in environmental assessments when we're talking about sizing infrastructure and where we should be going, allow us to do some of the pre-planning for these areas. And in fact, the areas in purple they're not in the urban area, but they're identified as future urban area in effect. The ministry didn't like that, but that's really what it was. We called it something else so that they were okay. But essentially, if we fully develop at kind of the rate we're going, this should easily last us to 2060, 2070 timeframe. In fact, it could very well last us longer than that. But recognizing that as you put a firm boundary on, there's a risk to some extent that you say everywhere's firm and then all of a sudden you need to break it for some reason. You've given really no guidance as to where. So what we looked at was, we've got the greenfield area to cover, I'm sorry, the protected countryside to cover, but the countryside is also important. And it's important to recognize that, the farmland in this area is key. It doesn't have the environmental features necessarily, but it's still important to protect. So as we went through it, we said, okay, this is the permanent line. Thou shalt never go outside this line. This is truly a hard urban edge. And it's hard urban by both planning policy, but also by infrastructure development. So there are no pipes heading towards the boundaries that have excess capacity to allow for development on the other side. There's no roads that butt out onto some of the boundary roads. Not all of them, some predated. But Wilmot Line, for example, which stretches the whole west side of Waterloo, there are no internal roads that abut the outside, go out onto Wilmot Line. It is literally an edge. Oops. excuse me. The other thing that we did was we looked at the other urban areas, or the edges of the urban area, and said, look, these are really long-term boundaries. We don't want to go outside them, but if in the future we have to, these are the areas that we would want it focused on, not in the areas of the permanent. And so this is a typical boundary in the region of Waterloo. In fact, the one that's here is Benjamin Road. The townhouse development up in the top center, in fact, was built in 1980. And you know, what you have on the, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but in the lower left side over here, it's a horse-drawn plow plowing the field. So we've done a good job. We're happy with where we're at. But I think the lesson in the region of Waterloo was we gain people's support. We gained the public support. We actually gained the development industry support to some extent by making sure that it didn't just go hard instantly. We set up a process that allows for that transition into what we honestly think will be a hard urban boundary. There may be some little movements out from it, but not much at all. And so on that, I will pass my screen back and we can move on. So Stephanie, are you just going to take it back there? Thank you. You're muted.
Yes, thank you. I have done so. Does that look right? Everybody can see.
And by the way, I want a different picture after seeing Ann's. I don't, definitely I want a different picture.
Next time then, Kevin. All right, so I'm just going to move. There we go. Go ahead, Ann, and you can let me know when you need me to proceed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Kevin. And thank you for all attending tonight, this topic, which is, I think, near and dear to all three of our hearts. We've spent a lot of our lives thinking about this. Kevin spoke about the sort of outside part of this. How do you define the hard urban boundary? And I'm going to talk about the fact that in order to keep that boundary hard, you really have to look at density inside the urban boundaries, which are that density inside the urban boundary is necessary to protect the outside. And in Halton and most of the other larger GTA municipalities, the province has actually defined population and employment numbers that municipalities are by policy required to accommodate in the next 20 years. So Halton is a little different than Waterloo in that sense, in that the province is provided a framework for accommodating growth. So when we do these projects looking at density inside the urban boundary, we have to keep one eye on what the province has said has to be accommodated. So just before I get into my slides, I want to emphasize that growth within this context includes people and jobs, so both homes and places of employment. And I just have a few slides that I want to go through to illustrate how we can achieve density in different ways and how there are pros and cons to those different ways of achieving density. Stephanie, you can move forward. So one of the things that we always have to think about is that it's a matter of perspective, how we look at density. Most of us are uncomfortable with change in our neighborhoods, in our areas. And so when we start to think about density and we visualize density, it can be a bit of a scary process. So the way that I'm going to talk about it tonight is kind of from a perspective point of view. So depending where you are and the stage you are in life, you're going to have a different perspective about density and what you want in your community. So for example, a 7-year-old might want to be able to bike to school, and their parents might want to be able to walk them to school and then jump on transit and go to work. Whereas a 70-year-old's perspective might be different. Maybe Amelie has lived in that neighborhood, in that community their whole life, and they want to see that there's affordable housing for their kids to also stay in that area, and they want to have accessibility as they age in place. I Imini is in a wheelchair, and so their priority will be accessibility and accessible street design and proximity to amenities so that they can move around. And then a mid-career person like Jocelyn might be at home raising kids and needs to have accessible streets for their stroller, but also, again, be able to jump onto transit and get to work and have the amenities around within walking distance. So all of these perspectives influence the way that we look at density. And these kind of perspectives change over time. And I did want to just start by acknowledging that COVID over the last year has really, it's really changed the way that we live and work. And as planners, we're all watching, and we're all doing a lot of research and trying to understand what's going on. But obviously working from home is something that has become part of the way we live, and that changes the demand for office buildings. It changes the way that the buildings will be built. It changes things like the way people shop and network from their homes. We've probably all experienced that over the last year. So really, we're all just going to have to stay tuned to see what that's going to mean in terms of our inside the urban boundary community building. So Stephanie, if you can just switch to the next one. Before I jump into some scenarios, I want to just highlight that when we plan for density, what we really want to aim for is something called complete communities. So complete communities are meeting the needs for daily living throughout an entire lifetime. So that's access to transit, employment, providing a variety of housing for many ages and stages, affordability of housing, healthy living with respect to green spaces, and local employment and stores. So there's a lot of change that I've seen in my time as a planner, which is really great, that's moving us to these more mixed communities that will give us these complete communities. So within those, there's two really impacts that density have. One is that density is achieved through a wide range of built options. So I've listed some here. So when I talk about built options, I mean the form. Is it single or townhouse or condo? Are they U-shaped? Are they point towers? Are they low-rise offices, high-rise offices? All of those different forms will give us different densities. We also look at complete street elements, like are there street trees? Are there bike lanes? Are there bus lanes? As well as the normal vehicle travel lanes. How is green space managed and street plantings? What are the building facades? Because the facades in new building can really impact the look and feel, the sense of peace or not having peace within a community, and supporting public use of schools, community centers, and so on. So those are the built elements of density. But density also, and this is the part that I think I really want to emphasize tonight, density can really change the character of a community. So the way that the buildings are built and the density of the buildings really affects affordability. And I'll talk about that in some scenarios. Active transportation and all the different multimodal transportation is often more supportable with higher densities. And similarly, amenities are supported differentially depending on the density. If you can imagine a small town trying to pay for amenities and infrastructure, as Kevin mentioned, it's quite a different story than if you're in a big city where you've got a big population, lots of employment, lots of tax and building revenues coming in. Similarly, open space can be really impacted by the way we tackle density and transit and multimodal. So these are sort of the elements I'm going to touch on pretty quickly in a number of scenarios, and then we're all happy to take questions on all of this. We can go to the next one, Stephanie. So these examples come from some work that we did in York Region called Visualizing Density. York, like Halton, is tackling density changes and asked us to put together, it was an interactive model, which I'm not doing tonight, but it allowed participants in workshops to actually play with different densities and what it would mean on real streets and real areas in York Region. So I'm just going to show you some of these as a way of illustrating the work that we did and the idea of density. And these were all around major transit station locations, so they're all pretty high density areas. So I'm going to go through 2 scenarios and then talk about sort of the community outcomes that result. So this scenario is a scenario where we have 15%, sorry, 85% people, meaning 85% of the area is for residential use and 15% is for jobs. So 15% employment, office type uses. So if you look at this, on the right-hand side, what we talk about are all of the positive aspects related to complete communities that come about by having a density of this nature. And this is something called 160 people and jobs per hectare. It's a pretty high density, but something that certainly Halton would be in this realm in some parts of Halton too. So in this case, there's a variety of housing near transit. There are more people who can benefit from parks and open space because the density's tweaked or skewed towards people. And you can have a higher variety of housing and potential for a lot of amenities within a 5 to 10 minute walk. So this example, higher number of people than jobs. Stephanie, if we can go to the next one, the next scenario in the same location is slightly different, where it's looking at the same 160 people in jobs, but in this case, 60% are the people residential side and 40% is the job. So this is a more even kind of a scenario where obviously local employment opportunities are going to be higher and they're in an easy walk of transit and people, because there's even number of people and houses or people and jobs. Public services could be co-located in a scenario like this to provide convenient access. And you're going to support local businesses because they'll have access to this reasonably high population nearby. And from an aesthetic perspective, the way that street trees and street greenery is provided really changes the feeling, the look and feel of this area. So then we can go to the next one, Stephanie. So then now I have a couple that are just a different way to visualize density in the same smaller location from scenario 1 that I just showed you. This first one, again, is 160 jobs and people with 85% people and 15% jobs. So this one is sort of, again, higher emphasis on the people side, the residential side. And you can see there's lots of residential housing, both in terms of single family, those white areas on the outside, and also single family and mid and high rise along the street. And then if we flip to the next one, Stephanie, same place, but this time we're looking at that other scenario, which was the 60-40 split with a more even spread of people and jobs, and you get more mixed use in this scenario. There's a greater number of office buildings and commercial uses, and that affords us to have businesses on the ground floor, which again supports those local businesses, the local ability for the people who live in this area to walk and go to the things that they need every day, shops and dry cleaners and gyms and all of those things that we access every day. And you'll see more mid to high-rise homes in this scenario. And then the last 3 are just 3 for a larger area. If we can just switch it, Stephanie. So this is a bit of a larger area. And in this case, we're looking at a higher density. So this is 200 jobs and people per hectare, which is a different, it gives us more density. So you can obviously see that immediately in this picture. Higher density leads to more mid and high-rise residential and less employment opportunities in this one. And then Stephanie moved to the next one, which has that balance, slightly greater balance, 60-40 split of people and jobs in this one. So this is, again, the height goes down a little bit and we get more of that street level shops and employment supporting local businesses. And then the last one is just for fun, sort of. This is all jobs. So if you went to a complete employment area, which there are lots of in Ontario and in the GTA, this is 200 jobs. Completely different look. Maybe Stephanie, just flip back the two and then forward, just so, yeah, you can just kind of see that's the mid one, that was the first one, and then back again to, so you can see there's different ways of achieving the same numbers in a sense. And then the last one I have is just a kind of extreme scenario. This is just to show you what happens when you go to 500 people and jobs per hectare. This is when you get into a real kind of downtown city feel of more high rises, a lot more density. This one has the 60-40 split. So this is a lot of kind of condo type high rises plus almost an equal number of jobs. This would be typical of a downtown in any of the large GTA municipalities. So I'm hoping that's helpful to you. I know there'll be questions. I already saw one flip up about heritage and how we handle that. And we can talk more about that. These were just visualizations, hypotheticals. Obviously, when you actually do real planning, you get into the details. So that's the end of my presentation. And now we're going to hear from Peter to talk about sort of an agricultural lens to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was very interesting. And I think what you have led us to is, what does it mean if you really push the densities? And in lots of cases, all we're hearing in this area is, 70 to 80, and people are backing up then. So it can be done, but it needs good thought and good planning. But I am just delighted to be on a panel with yourself and Kevin, such esteemed practitioners of planning, and look forward to the conversation later on. I think my role here tonight is, as usual, to better understand or try to understand why these plans have to happen and to encourage better outcomes from the process that we go through to get an official plan in place. But many times we would like to tell Queen Park to back off, especially right now when we already have 10 years worth of open land designated and ready to go because of our last OP. And now they want not only another 10 years on that, but another 10 years on that again to get us to 2051. And that's when I think we start to get out into less solid ground. So having heard Kevin talk about the countryside line and how well it has worked over the last many years, and it's going to be interesting to see what his thoughts are, because I really would like to see planning done more in shorter time frames, but with the understanding, and you got it that far out there, Kevin, you're talking about 20, 50, 60, and 70. So, it obviously can be done, and I like the way that Waterloo is expanding. But whenever I ask the planners here why we can't go to a hard urban boundary, their answer, well, it's not as easy now as it used to be. It will not work or hold up. And I have to ask, really? When I ask about the wording of complete communities, the comeback is, well, it's not market driven. And then I have to ask, who is telling whom what? Really, is it the madamies that are running the planning departments? When I ask about complete communities and the correlation to climate change and they are giving us scenarios of 50 jobs and residents per hectare, when they admit fully that to be transit friendly, one should be aiming for 70 or 80 per hectare. And with walking communities, the walking distances shouldn't be any more than 10 or 15 minutes to the services. And I have always seemed to come away with more questions than answers. And I really feel sometimes the planners are a little bit wimpish and not pushing back on developers as much as they could and should do. Over the years, I've been lucky to have been involved with various levels of governance and organizations, and feel that planning has definitely come a long way since when I first came to the country. But I think it can still improve further. Particularly as it affects, or climate change is changing, and the fact that now all the municipalities here in Halton have recognized it's an issue for consideration. I've also been involved in an industry that's come a long way. When I came to the country 45 years ago, a good corn crop would be considered 100 bushels to the acre. Now we're pushing way over 160 bushels, which suck up a lot more of the sunshine and sequester carbon. We used to plow every acre before planting. Now that is reduced to less than 15%. So we're not releasing that stored carbon back up into the atmosphere. Most farmers now are either running no-till or minimum till methods and using cover crops to sequester carbon. So just as we saw in Ann's PowerPoint, where they had green roofs, which were used to capture the sunlight and to control water, that is what agriculture is moving more and more to. I did take a trip around the south end of Milton on Friday just to better understand what was left out there to be built up. And I was using the map 1 from the 2009 OP. And there's still a minimum of 3,000 acres of available land to be built upon. And when I talked to one of our local councillors, he was telling me that there should have been a population of 162,000 people in Milton in 2021. And the numbers that they are working with at the present time, it's only at 128,000. So that's 20% less or more. And I gather right now that the number of developers who are not meeting their allotted numbers of builds, and I think a lot of that has to do with where is the immigration. So I have to ask, when you're trying to start off and build appropriately, you know, where is your starting point? What has happened to the immigration? What's going to happen with working from home once we get COVID beat? I realize that some of this is not directly speaking to hard urban boundaries, but I would encourage everybody involved tonight to become a lot more involved in this official plan. And maybe it will get us to where we think we need to be, and that is with a better understanding for a hard urban boundary, even if it can be considered in 10-year increments, because as we all know, economic conditions change, housing design and technology changes, planning and climate circumstances change. And an example that I like to use here in the region is we fought long and hard over a landfill site that was meant to last for 25 years, and it's lasted nearly 40, and it's still going strong. This is because technology has changed. The green bins, the blue bins came along. And so I'm going to suggest that we can do better because things will change. And when you're working over 30 years, massive changes can take place. Fortunately, we all want good planning outcomes, or we wouldn't be here tonight. But we do need to comply with Queen's Park, and their deadline is June or July of 2022. And in that intervening period, I think I would like to hope that we can get a more orderly use of the agricultural land that will be designated for those 30 years by encouraging both intensification and densification. Have regard for climate change because it is definitely changing. How do we better use the development charges dollars, the capital grants that do come to the municipalities? While can we move closer to green development standards, adopting new technologies that will come down the pipe over the next 30 years? So with that, I will just hold it at that, and I thank you for being there tonight. And if I may, Kevin, can I start the questions by asking, because you did work on the growth plan, and you know where a lot of the numbers come from that come to the regions from various entities. Do you think that we are getting the right numbers, and do you have any concern about their validity?
Thanks, Peter. I don't think there's any question at all that the numbers they've changed over time. And I typed this in on an answer to one of the Q&As just a second ago. But just to build it out, in 2006, we set a 50 people and jobs per hectare, residents and jobs per hectare density for the designated greenfield area. And that was really based on ensuring two things. One was that the densities in the greenfield area would at least come close to, if not exceed, transit supportive densities. And that's really critical. You're not going to be able to provide transit everywhere, but you certainly, you're not going to apply, or you're not going to end up with effective transit everywhere, but you certainly want to, fairly dramatically increase the densities from what we were experiencing in 2006, so that transit was a viable option in most of the designated greenfield area. And so that was one piece. The other was we were getting, especially because of the high number of people in each unit in some of the communities like Peel and York, because of the immigrant community, they have a higher number of people per households. On average in Waterloo, we were about 2.79 persons per unit in single detached dwellings. In York, they were about 3.4. So when you look at a 50 density, what you did was you pushed the density up to a point that you couldn't just meet it by building singles, so that we were starting to get a good mix in the greenfield community, or in the DGA. And so when we did that, it created a challenge for some municipalities. We had to, in the region of Waterloo, increase from about 41 or 42 were the densities that were coming in plans of subdivision. We actually put a 55 target in place. And I think we came very close. If we didn't actually achieve them, we came awfully close to that. Then along came the 2017 growth plan, and it jacked those densities to 80. And that was difficult for two reasons. One was 80 doesn't compare to 50 in the 2006 growth plan directly, because what they did was they also changed the way the takeouts were assumed. So the densities weren't calculated over the same areas. And so an 80 in the 2017 growth plan really was about 70 in the 2006 one. That would be the comparable one. But the big problem was they made that 70 or 80 retroactive over all of the DGA. And when by that point we had 11 years worth of development, and what had occurred was a lot was at a 50 or 55 average, even those areas had to count as 80 under the new densities because it was averaged over the entire DGA. And what that meant was that if the old areas that had already built in the last 10 years, and they're not going to rebuild in the next little while, we actually had to get upwards in the neighborhood of 120 to 150 in the remaining DGA in order to average it totally out to 70 or 80 in the entirety of it. And that was just unreasonable. So what they did was they lowered it down to 50 again. But what they didn't do was they didn't revert the takeouts back to the 2006 version. So a 50 today equates to about a 42 in 2006, which means that the densities today are almost exactly what we had before the growth plan came along. And they mean, we're definitely not transit supportive in the greenfield, and we're actually requiring more land under the 2019 growth plan than we would under the 2006. So there's a long answer to your question, but I think the bullet point at the end is really they are too low now. They need to go back up. They need to get up into comparing to the 2006 plan. They need to get into about the 60 or 65 range to really achieve the objectives of the growth plan. So.
Yeah, no, that's a very good answer, and I think we really need to better understand how to look at it, and I think this leads me, if I may, Anne, to a question for yourself, and that is, what I thought I was seeing in your presentation was more of a Main Street type situation, and some of those numbers were dramatically higher than I think most people, at least in Milton, would be wanting to see at this point in time. But in reality, is that considered a complete community or a walking community, or is the setback of the singles behind it what makes up those types of communities? And is there any differentiation in your mind?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Peter. Good question. So the examples I gave were for a transit station areas. So they are the densest areas that municipalities are going to have, because the idea of the growth plan is to try to focus growth around those transit stops. They cost a lot of money to build the infrastructure for transit, and it only works when there are high density users near enough that they can walk and bike ideally to those main transit stations. So those are high, and they happen to be ones that I could easily put my hand on and sort of run through scenarios. But I realized from some of the questions that maybe I should just say a few words about the process that typically happens in one of these growth plans. Some people, I think, will be familiar with this, but just quickly, these studies, they're pretty intensive, and Halton will be doing this work. Certainly there will be lots of surveys done and lots of research done about what people do want, and also what the effects of COVID will be, and what is going on with immigration and so on. So that's one of the starting points. Another piece that goes into this is looking at the properties that are vacant and could handle higher densities. So typically one of these studies will look at those properties and consider how they fit in. And then all the important takeouts work is done. So looking at environmental sensitivity and agriculture, which I'd like to circle back to. And then it's a process of looking not just at those transit stations, but at the whole area, Peter. So we don't just have linear growth areas, but from those we fan out into the whole area. And each sort of quadrant or area within a municipality will have different characteristics. And typically in these studies, and I assume Halton will do this, a lot of work happens with the communities defining what those priorities are in terms of what's an appropriate density to support transit and to support all those things we've been talking about, but also what's an appropriate density to preserve the things that we like in our communities as they exist now, and come up with a kind of a balance of high density areas and areas that are lower. A really interesting question that's swirling around a lot right now is the whole idea of stable communities. And I think someone mentioned it either in the presentation or in one of the questions. A lot of the homes that we see all across the GTA were built at a time when people had big families and even multiple families in those big houses. And now often there's just two people living in those homes. So there's a real question about whether we could start to think about how we densify what we sort of call stable neighborhoods and accept adding more permissive ability to have higher, like have additional families or change homes so that more than one family can live there. Very controversial, but it's a way to use the land in a more responsible way. And I did just want to mention, sort of as part of this process piece, a number of the projects that I've worked on are in areas, I think, like Halton, where virtually every piece of land outside the built up area is prime agricultural land. There's so little land that isn't prime. Anytime the urban boundary expands, you are going onto important agricultural land. Hamilton is certainly in that situation too. So it's a real tough one, and you know, that's why getting higher density is the answer, because with higher densities, whether it's by infilling and adjusting stable neighborhoods or through ensuring that any new development is denser, we can hold those boundaries firm. And if we do have to expand, boy, we better be looking at something beyond just soil capability, because so much of Southern Ontario is prime land. And maybe Peter can speak to this, but how do you judge which agricultural land is sort of available for development? You know, most of us would probably say none, but sometimes those hard questions have to be answered. So there is a process that goes into these that looks at lots of factors, and like Peter and Kevin, I would encourage all of you to really stay involved and contribute, because you all care, I think, deeply about the environment and Halton.
Peter, if I can jump in for a second, I think one of the things that I've found really interesting as we work through the process in the region of Waterloo, and just to give people a couple statistics, in the region of Waterloo, since the growth plan came in, we've managed to achieve 53% intensification, which, you know, we started that process back in 2006. We were probably realistically about 15. So there was a real effort made to promote it. But what's really interesting is that two things. The first is the question about what are the baby boomers going to do in their retirement? And this is a really important question, because ultimately, if intensification is almost always done through multiples. And in fact, what we're finding is that more and more of the boomers are actually looking for the potential to retire in multiples. And so we've gone through the 80s and 90s when we built virtually nothing that was really conducive to seniors' lifestyles. And the question ultimately becomes, in the next 20 to 30 years, are we continuing to build single detached dwellings in the suburbs for young people? Or is there an alternative, which is, can we build the types of multiple dwellings that support seniors in their changing lifestyle and have their units, which are typically single detached these days, have those recycled for use by the young people? So the question in a lot of ways becomes, are we building for the baby boom and what they're going to do in the next 20 years? Or are we going to continue to build singles for young families like we have? And what we're finding is that there's a mix there that makes sense. And just one quick story, I've got a gentleman that I used to do a lot of presentations with. We seem to end up in the same panels. And he was saying every time he promotes a mid-rise development, he'll end up being appealed to the Ontario Municipal Board. And virtually every time it's seniors in the community that are promoting the appeal, because they're the ones with times to support an appeal. They're also the ones with the money to be able to afford it. And typically at the end of the day, the board will side with the developer if it's well thought out. And what he said that was so fascinating was, he said in virtually every situation, when he's opened the model home for the new mid-rise development, that one of the first groups of people in are the appellants. The people that in fact opposed it have begun to realize that, I want to age in my neighborhood. I want to stay near the amenities that I'm used to, but I don't necessarily want to stay in a 3,000 square foot home on 2 stories as I get older. And so, the opportunity that is presented by properly located mid-rises that increase densities in nodes and along corridors actually provide the opportunity for people my age, seniors, to age in their neighborhood as opposed to age in their single detached dwelling. And the future, to a great extent, I think, is around that. I think the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to be building multiples for young people that can't afford to get into the single detached market, or we're going to be building multiples for seniors that are going to be freeing up the single detached units they live in now. So it's intensification. You've got to step back and look at the future. It's not the past. We're not just in a position where we have one clientele in the suburbia, which is the young families. We now have the opportunity for different forms of markets.
Great.
So what would in your mind, what's the difference between intensification and densification?
Go ahead and answer that question. That was actually a question in the comments, but then after that, I'd like to get to the questions of some of the attendees, if that's okay.
Well, technically, intensification, as defined by the growth plan, is anything inside the built boundary. So inside the built-up area as it existed in 2006. Densification is really, how do you take an area and take a look at how you increase the number of people living in that area, increase the opportunity for additional people to live in that area. And really, that's what Ann's work is doing, is taking a look at how can that be done sensitively and actually be used to create a living environment, a sense of place that people want to be in. And maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly true. And typically those nodes and corridors end up absorbing a large amount of that intensification number. I mean, Kevin, you might know for Waterloo, and I don't have the numbers for Halton, but in some of the projects that we've done, those nodes and corridors along the transit stations if they're really dense, like those images that I showed you, they can actually absorb a lot of the growth that the province has allocated, so that allows you to do interesting things in the other areas that are more stable neighborhoods, and protect things that need to be protected. So sometimes you have to sort of bite the bullet and say, okay, we're gonna intensify in certain areas so that we can have what we want in other places.
And even building on that a little bit, Anne, I think you make a good point there, is one of the things that Victor Doyle, one of the planners who used to be with the Minister of Municipal Affairs, he's really focused in on the fact that there are millions of empty bedrooms in our single detached dwellings spread throughout the country, and especially in the GGH. When you take a look at the baby boomers who own a phenomenal number of single detached dwellings, most of them are or they're heading towards retirement. They're between 75 and 55 years of age, and virtually none of them have kids at home, except for the ones who went to university and forgot to get jobs. We won't count them right now. But the reality is the house that was built and has the capacity, the single detached unit that has the capacity for 4 or 5 people easily, is now accommodating 1 or 2. And so if we can encourage and facilitate the movement of the retiring baby boomer out of their single detached dwelling, not only do we intensify along the corridor, but that single detached dwelling goes from 1 resident to maybe 3 or 4, if in fact it's bought by a young family. And all of a sudden we're better utilizing all the infrastructure in the community yet again. And so it's not even like, the only way to accommodate additional population is in the intensification unit, but also in the units that an intensification unit frees up. So you just got to think through those things. It's interesting. Nobody talks, not a lot of people talk about that, but it's a critical component to accommodating the future population.
Well, thank you. Thank you, all of our panelists, for all of your insights so far. And I just have to say there are a lot of questions that are coming in. I've asked people to start voting for some of those questions because I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all of them. And I've also invited the panelists to type some answers if they're able to, because as questions are answered, they're still visible to our viewers. And so that's great. So if I'm going to move on to some questions from the viewers. This is a popular one and a little bit connected, I think, to what we've just been talking about. Are there any studies of how many acres of open parking or redundant buildings there are in a particular community, and how many jobs and residents can be accommodated on those parcels of land? Example, old strip malls, surface parking lots, Class C or lower office. Why is it that all the growth land is previously undeveloped when there is so much developed land that is underutilized? A comment on perhaps how wasteful we are of land in Canada, perhaps. Anyone wish to? Anne, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I'll start off, and I imagine Kevin will want to throw some thoughts in here too. So absolutely, looking at vacant land is a fundamental starting point to these growth studies. And any of the ones that I've been involved in, that was one of the first things that we do, is look at that, like parking lots, underutilized land where, I don't know, it's been unused, maybe buildings are there, but unused for years. The challenge is that that's usually privately owned land. It's rarely public. So you can't force a developer or an owner to, even if you upzone it, so even if you zone it for multi-story homes or offices, you can't force the owner to actually go ahead and, go to market and redevelop. Like, that's their own choice. That's the free market that we have. So municipalities are doing creative things around that, identifying lands that they really think are fundamental kingpins to, say, the development of an area or a strip, and literally contacting the developers, the owners, talking to them, trying to come up with ways that the municipality can incentivize those properties to build out. So really important. it's sort of the starting point and a fundamental piece of this, but unfortunately we can't make people develop their land. Kevin, thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the first things that we did back around 2002 was we tried to do an inventory of how much capacity there was in the urban area. And there was a couple things that jumped out. The first was contaminated sites. And their contaminated sites are so problematic for most municipalities. And in fact, if you go back to the late 90s, we were most planners and most municipalities were told if a study that comes in that says a site's contaminated, don't even open the envelope, because if you know about it, there's some liability that accrues. And so these became, just horrendous places that nobody wanted to touch. And then most of us, as planners kept going that way. And a couple people started to look at it and say, you know what, instead of risk avoidance, maybe we need to risk manage these types of sites. Are we not better off to actually get them cleaned up? And if we can find a way to balance the cost of developing on a contaminated site with the cost of developing on a greenfield area for a developer, then maybe we can actually do some public good and get these sites cleaned up and bring them up for intensification. And some of them are the best. I mean, these are some of the best places in our communities. We have factories all over the north side of downtown Kitchener that were stunning in the architecture and whatnot, but they needed assistance to come onto the market. So what we came up with in Waterloo is what's called a tax increment financing, so a TIF. And basically what it is a vacant lot that's contaminated generates almost zero assessment. You may get lucky and get $100,000 out of it or something. That same site with a mid-rise building is going to generate somewhere in the $1 million range. And so the difference between those two is what's generated when somebody takes the initiative to clean up the site and make it available. And what we decided was it should be a shared responsibility between us and the developer. And so what we did was we basically developed a program that said the difference between the 100,000 we're getting today and the $1 million we would get per year if it was fully developed, that in fact, we should share that with the developer to some extent to assist them in paying for the contamination cleanup. And we found it to be a highly successful program. And in fact, it broke the roadblocks to allow those to open up. The other thing that we've had huge amounts of development on contaminated sites in the region of Waterloo. And because of that, we've had tons cleaned up. The other thing that we found was I would sit with Virgil Martin, who is our IT guy, and we'd look at aerial photos, and Virgil would say, well, here's a vacant lot or here's a parking lot. And we identified those. And then as time went on, what we found was, yes, those developed, but it was also the ones that had single detached dwellings and had small plazas and those types of things that as the demand for intensification went up, that those in fact were targets as well. And I knew we were in a different world when there was at the corner of, Albert and Columbia Albert and Columbia in Waterloo, there was a board hearing where somebody wanted to sever their backyard and build a second single detached unit on the lot. It went to the Ontario Municipal Board. The board approved it. They built the house. So there's now 2 singles on the lot. And 2 years later, somebody came and tore them both down and put up a mid-rise. So we actually had, you get to the point where the value of the property exceeds even the development that's there today. And so it's, when you look at it, there is virtually unlimited capacity within most urban areas for intensification, as long as you protect some of the important things, the inner city urban green spaces, this truly stable neighborhoods, the heritage areas are all important. They're part of what makes a community a special place, but there are so many other places that you can develop.
All right, Kevin, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move along. We're just getting more and more questions, so I really have to. So if we can try to keep our responses as brief and specific, I guess, to the questions as we can. And again, I invite you to go in and type a few answers if possible. So another popular question now. My neighborhood in Oakville, which used to be a modest neighborhood, now is having houses torn down and huge houses built, usually inhabited by a small family. How can we get a mix of housing in an established neighborhood like mine so that there's more density and public transit becomes more feasible? Is that maybe something for Anne, perhaps?
Sure, I mean, the simple answer is that if you change the zoning to allow a wider range of housing types, then people can be permitted to build different types of housing. And it's not done very much, and it should be done more because of this whole point of underutilized buildings. So we have to accept that, and councils are very, very resistant to change the zoning in these what so-called stable areas, because they know they'll get blowback from neighbors. So, you know, we as a society have to change our attitudes and encourage that kind of zoning, because there's nothing to stop it from happening. It's just not, most places are not zoned to allow it right now.
Thank you, Anne. The next question, do we have stats on what young families want these days? Do they want houses with big yards at any price? Or might they then require having at least one car? Or might they be seeking more affordable townhouses with small yards and more walkability?
I'll jump in. I think it's a mix of both. I think that's what's happened, is that we're now seeing younger people with kids who are seeking an urban lifestyle where we didn't see that very much anymore in the past. And that's evolved over the last 20 years. I think, you know, again, a lot of people focus in on the only way that intensification is going to work is if the young families end up having to go there, because we've typically built to accommodate young families. And all of a sudden, if we're building a lot of intensification, people equate that. And that's again where I go back and say, if we're building for the boomer in their retirement as part of the intensification, we free up the single for the young families.
This question might kind of link to that. If you feel like you've answered it with that, then let me know. But one question that one of our attendees gets is that regarding increasing density in existing neighborhoods, which are actually declining in population, but are resistant to change and even opposing accessory apartments and granny flats. How do you convince people to allow for change, such as triplexes and small apartment buildings, like 4 to 6 floors high? How might we support that shift?
Yeah, I'll throw in some thoughts here. There has been a lot of effort put in by municipalities along that line. Certainly in Toronto, we've seen, which I know most municipalities don't want to be compared to Toronto, but Toronto has done some pretty innovative engagement with communities. As you can imagine, it's important. And if you do that, if you do engagement carefully and you do it with good visualizations and you walk people through what it means, you can start to change people's minds about these things. But if you don't do that, people aren't going to change their minds. You know, it's not something that is just going to happen randomly. It's something that people have to be walked through hand in hand using, you know, literally virtual, you know, those glasses that you put on and you can walk through, you can get a feeling like, honestly, that's what's happening now, is to really let people touch and feel it, because people's natural inclination is to dislike change. Like, it's just sort of the human condition where we're not interested in change very much. So it can be done, but it has to be done sensitively and carefully.
Thanks, Anne. Another question that I think might end up going to Peter, if he's still there with us, I hope. Agricultural lands should stay agricultural lands, no matter who owns them. Food is an essential resource. Who is looking out for our food security and sustainability if we keep concreting over and relying on soon-to-be unreliable food imports? So who's looking out for our food security and sustainability in our agricultural lands?
I would hate to think that people are that worried, but we within agriculture, as I alluded to, have increased production and have been able to up till now, and there will be new technology. We've seen some of it in the large greenhouse operations that are springing up in southwestern Ontario. There is more coming from containerized lighting systems that are growing vegetables. So technology will change. And thus far we've been able to keep up, but when will we hit 9 billion in the world? And the other great thing that we have going for us is the amount of fresh water that we have within reach, and that is going to be a major issue down the road. But there are still many farmers who really enjoy what they do and are doing it to the best of their ability. At this point in time, it is not necessarily the issue, but I think governments and even our own organizations are starting to say, yeah, collectively, we have to start to consider what climate change is going to do, and you know, how do we not lose our way?
Okay, thank you, Peter. I actually have another question here for you, I believe. Farmers have said that selling their land was how they planned to finance their retirement. How do we handle this while protecting our green space from development? As once a farm is built on, it can never come back. Any thoughts on that, Peter?
No, that is a very true statement. And what we have seen leave Halton has been the livestock sector. And so we've had a change from both livestock and cropping to basically cropping. And but those are families that are multi-generational and have been able to move, well, in the Kevin's back door in Waterloo, or down east to Prince Edward County, and being able to set up there and buy land, you know, to set the families up for generations to come. So there are pros and cons on that.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Anne, I think this might be for you. Wondering about your thoughts on high density on 2-lane downtown streets where sunlight is mostly blocked except near midday.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think what we see when we design those streets is really a move to doing a lot more modeling with looking at light and looking at. I think most of you will be familiar with the sort of recessed building facade. So at the street, it's lower, and then it gradually moves up to a higher number of floors, so that you don't get that feeling of being in a tunnel like we saw or we see with older high density urban areas. And then it allows for a lot more public uses along the streetscapes. In fact, Kitchener has done a really good job on some of that. And we're seeing it all over the place. So to me, that's the best solution, is really start with what kind of characteristic of a street do we want, and then add the buildings, as opposed to starting with the buildings and hoping the street works out.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have hard statistics that shows sprawling residential development without commensurate industrial and commercial development impoverishes communities over time?
I'll jump in. I can't point you directly to something, a specific study, but certainly there is. We had a mayor in North Dumfries Township who used to carry around a pad of paper where he listed all the costs associated with residential development versus the assessment that he got from it. And it never seemed to work out. And in fact, I think what we find is that over time, it's extremely difficult to create a sustainable community that is entirely a bedroom community, in part because of the assessment issues, but it's also in part because of transportation issues, that everybody's commuting. People aren't there in the long term, like they're not there for longer periods of time. They tend to be buying in other communities. So it becomes difficult. And actually one of the most bizarre ones that really taught me something was, again, the mayor in North Dumfries who told us that they had trouble staffing a volunteer fire department in Ayr because nobody was there during the day. Mm-hmm. Everybody that would otherwise be part of a volunteer fire department were somewhere else. So it's a weird mix of answers there, but definitely from a pure financial standpoint, the benefit to having balanced economic and residential lands together is huge. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, I'll just add that both the Neptus Foundation and the Canadian Urban Institute have done research on this, and there is actually some pretty good data that's shown and supported really the province and the moves they've made. The good moves, not the more recent ones, I guess.
That's great. And would you be able to type the names of where people might seek, like search for that just through the chat?
Trying to find the question. I'll just have to.
Oh, even just type it in the chat. No worries.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The illustrations that Anne presented showed a considerable gap between the major street and the buildings, irrespective of the building format. It has walkways as well as some open space in front of the building. However, we are observing several blocks in North Oakville where the residential buildings are right on a major road, posing serious concerns about safety as well. How are such plans put into place? I guess they're wondering, like, how does that planning process end up coming to fruition with different concepts?
Yeah, usually there is a pretty intense amount of, I'm not mute, am I?
No, you're good.
There's usually an intense consultation that will take place if there's a major reconstruction of a road. Certainly an environmental assessment has to be done, and typically there will also be changes through the OP process or the local planning process. So I would encourage you to be involved and to actually take seriously looking at the options when they get presented. There was a sort of period where there was a real a move towards having big tall buildings right up against the streets as a way to sort of revitalize the streets, because then you had a lot of action happening on the streets. But the downside to that is, I think, the things that were just pointed out, and also the light issues that were raised previously. So it's finding a way to get that density right up against the street, so you do get a vibrant street and you get people on the street when COVID is over and we have things to do on our streets, but also not to make it feel like a tunnel or feel unsafe, really. So that idea of building the buildings back a little bit gives you the same density typically, but allows the streetscape to be a lot more attractive.
Okay.
So the process is there's lots of consultation required by the province and by the municipalities. It's a matter of getting involved, really.
Okay, that's great. There are so many questions, and I apologize to everyone. I think there's also several comments, which we appreciate, and we will be looking through those. And I will not be able to get through all the questions. I'm so sorry. There's a question about making bedroom communities into more complete communities with building more access to public transit and local employment. Is there a way for that to be done? And I wonder, if that's just zoning, as was mentioned, that these neighborhoods need to be rezoned to permit different types of building. I'm going to put that to Anne, I think.
Sorry, I was typing.
Are there opportunities to make bedroom communities that consist of mostly single family homes with not much access to good public transit or local employment into complete communities?
Yeah, so that comes back to the ideas that Kevin and I have both been throwing around, which is to rezone some of those communities to allow, say, changes to occur in the homes, to say split them into multiple homes, to tear down and build like little pockets of higher density. So that's one piece of it. I see there have been a lot of questions about how do you encourage the older population like myself and Kevin and maybe Peter to actually move out of our homes into smaller things. And I think a number of people have said there's no incentive. Like it's easier and cheaper to stay in your own home that's too big than to sell and move into a smaller place that's in a complete community. And it's a challenge that we collectively need to put our minds to. And a huge part of that is finding ways to have affordable, smaller homes in urban, dense areas. Because what we're seeing is sort of the opposite right now, where those denser downtown, smaller condos typically are pretty expensive. And so it's pretty hard to justify in your head, if you're an older person, I'm going to sell my, my house with a yard and all this stuff and the memories of 30 years and literally for the same amount of money have something that's a tiny fraction of the size without some of the amenities that you have now. So we got to crack this one, because it's not healthy for the seniors and it's not good for the population coming up who could make better use of those homes. So it's a combination of zoning and changing and somehow finding a way to have affordable urban homes, in my mind. Kevin, you probably have thoughts too.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the absolute best policies in the 2006 growth plan, and equally one of the most ignored policies in the growth plan by everybody, was a policy that said that smaller communities should not be allowed to expand unless the expansion was actually taking them towards a 1/3 jobs versus residents. If you're not moving in that direction, you shouldn't be allowed to expand. It survived one growth plan. I don't think anybody implemented it, but it was about the only type of thing that you could do that really encouraged communities of the day to, if you're going to plan for expansions for residential, you also have to plan for those other components that make you a complete community. The market will decide whether or not those lands or there's uptake on that other stuff, but we shouldn't be allowing the small communities to just plan for residential, which is what so many of them do today.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to have to bring the Q&A to a close, despite several great other questions that have come in, but we really appreciate all the engagement of our attendees tonight, and particularly want to thank our panelists, Anne, Kevin, and Peter, for joining us and to try to provide some more context to this situation, some answers, and a little bit better understanding, I hope, for all of us in our community. One thing we just wanted to let you know about is that there is going to be another webinar available next Tuesday evening. It's very short notice, but the information has just been coming together on growing the Greenbelt, regional resilience. And it's really, Halton Environmental Network is hosting Ontario Headwaters in that conversation. They're bringing us the presentation to guide people in understanding how to provide feedback regarding the growth of the intended growth of the Greenbelt. So we invite you to join there. Lisa has put the link for that event into the chat, which you should be able to access directly. And I think that is it for this evening. So thank you again, everyone. If you're interested in following any other of HEN's activities, you can follow us through any of our social media channels. Thank you again for being here. Yes, Kevin.
Just one last thing. If there is somebody out there that we've missed a question that they really feel they want an answer for, I'm just in the process of putting my email, which is always a risk, but I just put it into the chat. And if you feel there's something that you want to ask, please feel free to use my email, and I'll see if I can respond to it. And try not to pass it on to too many people, but there's some good questions that were asked here we didn't get a chance to respond to. So there you go.
Thank you, Kevin. That's generous. Thank you very
And
much. Oh, and Anne
Ann
has joined as well in that. Appreciate both of you offering that opportunity up. We appreciate that very much. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.